Before the silhouette of a single basilica dome rose against the Adriatic sky, before the first stone of a doge's palace was laid, the foundation of Venice was not an act of human ambition, but the slow, inexorable work of geological time. The Venetian lagoon, the cradle of the future republic, owes its existence to the final retreat of the Worm glaciation, a climatic shift that began approximately 20,000 years ago. As the vast alpine glaciers melted, they unleashed torrents of water and sediment, carving new paths for rivers like the Po, the Brenta, and the Piave. These waterways carried immense loads of silt and sand eastward, depositing them into the northern Adriatic Sea. Over millennia, this process created a complex system of barrier islands, or lidi, which acted as a natural breakwater, enclosing a vast, shallow basin of saltwater marsh and mudflats. This semi-enclosed body of water, measuring some 550 square kilometers, became a unique littoral environment, a liminal space between land and sea where life was governed not by the calendar, but by the twice-daily rhythm of the tides. Into this challenging but protective landscape came the Veneti, an Indo-European people whose precise origins remain a subject of scholarly debate, but who established a distinct cultural presence in the region by the first millennium BCE. Roman historians like Livy would later record their traditions, identifying them as allies in the struggle against the Celtic tribes of the Po Valley. Archaeological evidence from sites like Este and Padua reveals a sophisticated Iron Age culture, noted for its bronze work and its trade in amber from the distant Baltic. While their primary centres were on the mainland, the Veneti were the first to systematically exploit the resources of the lagoon. They established small, scattered settlements on the higher, more stable islands, constructing dwellings on wooden piles driven deep into the marshy soil to create a firm foundation. Their existence was amphibious, a constant negotiation with the water. They perfected the design of flat-bottomed boats capable of navigating the treacherous shallows and intricate network of channels. Just a quick announcement, if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. Their economy was not based on conventional agriculture, which the saline soil made nearly impossible, but on the unique bounty of the lagoon. They became masters of salt production, channeling seawater into shallow pans and allowing the sun to evaporate the water, leaving behind the crystalline mineral that was a precious and vital commodity throughout the ancient world. Fishing and fowling provided sustenance, and their intimate knowledge of the tidal flats allowed them to harvest shellfish and other marine life. This was not a society that conquered its environment, but one that survived through a profound and pragmatic understanding of its rhythms, developing a unique resilience that would become the defining characteristic of the civilization that was to follow. The relative security of the Roman-administered Veneto, a landscape of prosperous cities like Aquileia, Padua, and Altinum, connected by the enduring logic of Roman roads, began to fracture in the early 5th century. The first tremors were felt with the incursions of Alaric's Visigoths, whose campaigns in 401 and 408 AD, while primarily focused on plunder and political leverage, shattered the illusion of imperial invincibility. The sack of Rome itself, in 410 AD, sent a profound psychological shockwave across the Italian peninsula. For the wealthy landowners and officials of the mainland cities, the inaccessible islands of the lagoon transitioned from being marginal economic zones to potential temporary refuges. This initial migration was tentative, a precautionary measure by an elite who still perceived their mainland villas and urban centres as the permanent heart of their world. This perception was irrevocably annihilated in 452 AD with the arrival of Attila and his Huns. This was not a raid, but a campaign of systematic destruction intended to erase the Roman presence from the land. The great port of Aquileia, a vital administrative and commercial hub, was so completely levelled that its exact location would be debated for centuries. The cities of Concordia, Altinum, and Padua suffered a similar fate, their populations either slaughtered or put to flight. This cataclysm triggered the first truly significant and semi-permanent wave of migration into the lagoon. These were not aristocrats hedging their bets, but entire communities of desperate refugees, carrying what little they could salvage to the relative safety of islands like Torcello, Malamocco, and the cluster of islets that would be known as Rivolto. The formal collapse of the Western Empire in 476 AD and the subsequent establishment of the Ostrogothic kingdom under Theodoric brought a period of comparative stability, but the mainland's social and economic infrastructure was fundamentally broken. The final decisive impetus for permanent settlement came with the Lombard invasion of 568 AD. Unlike the Goths, who had attempted to assimilate into the Roman administrative framework, the Lombards were perceived as a profoundly alien force, whose arrival represented a complete societal displacement rather than a mere change in governance. Their conquest was not a political negotiation, but a demographic replacement. This final wave of migration was qualitatively different. Mainland populations abandoned their ancestral homes with no expectation of return. They fled not as temporary exiles, but as the founders of a new society, bringing with them the last vestiges of Roman order, civic administrators, skilled artisans, and crucially, ecclesiastical authority. The flight of Bishop Paulus of Altinum, who transferred the seat of his diocese to the island of Torcello, was a definitive statement that the old world was gone, and that the future, however uncertain, would be built upon the saltwater foundations of the lagoon. The necessity of refuge hardened into the reality of permanent habitation, forcing the transplanted mainland communities to engineer a new civilization from water and marsh. On islands like the heavily populated Torcello and the strategically positioned Malamocco, the first great challenge was the creation of solid ground itself. Lacking stone quarries, the settlers developed a foundational technique that would define Venetian engineering for a millennium, driving thousands of water-resistant alder and oak piles deep through the soft mud and into the compressed clay subsoil known as Caranto. This dense forest of underwater pilings created a stable platform upon which they could lay timber rafts and Istrian stone, literally raising their settlements from the sea. A society without arable land required a radical reinvention of its economic basis. The lagoon's most immediate and valuable resource was not soil, but salt. The settlers refined and expanded upon ancient harvesting techniques, creating a vast network of salt pans that became the cornerstone of their economy. This white gold was a strategic commodity of immense value, essential for preserving food across Europe. The nascent Venetian state quickly understood its importance, establishing a state monopoly, the Sal Magistracy, that controlled production and export, providing the capital for civic development and shipbuilding. Fishing, likewise, evolved from a source of local sustenance into a significant commercial enterprise, with preserved and salted fish becoming a key export to the protein-starved Lombard mainland. It was maritime trade, however, that determined their destiny. Their earliest commercial ventures were not grand voyages to the Orient, but the vital, dangerous work of coastal cabotage, acting as intermediaries between two hostile worlds. With their unique boat-building skills, honed by the demands of navigating both shallow channels and the open Adriatic, they became the primary carriers of goods between the remaining territories of the Byzantine Exarchate of Ravenna and the new Lombard and Frankish kingdoms of northern Italy. They transported grain, wine, and textiles from Byzantine ports, exchanging them on the mainland for timber, metal, and, crucially, slaves sourced from the Slavic interior, a trade that was lucrative though morally fraught. This constant movement of goods established the Rivolto cluster of islands as a natural commercial hub, an emporium where contracts were made and cargoes exchanged. Power in this nascent society was not measured in acres, but in the number of ships owned, the value of commercial contracts, and control over a particular trade route, creating a pragmatic and fiercely competitive merchant class that would shape the Republic's political future. The nascent lagoon society, forged in the crucible of invasion, found itself in a precarious geopolitical position, a sliver of Roman heritage caught between the land-based power of the Lombard kingdom and the distant, but still formidable, authority of the Byzantine Empire. Subjugation to the Lombards would have meant assimilation into a feudal, agrarian society, an existential threat to their unique maritime identity. Allegiance to Constantinople was therefore not a matter of sentiment, but of survival. By formally acknowledging the suzerainty of the Eastern Roman Emperor, the Venetians secured a crucial measure of legitimacy that elevated them above the status of mere fugitives. They became the Ducatus Venetiae, a remote duchy, officially administered under the Exarchate of Ravenna, the centre of Byzantine power in Italy. This nominal subservience provided a vital diplomatic shield. An attack on Venice could be construed as an attack on the empire itself, a gamble that Lombard and later Frankish rulers were often hesitant to take. In return for this protection, Venice became a strategic asset for Constantinople. It served as a vital naval outpost in the Upper Adriatic, a bulwark against Slavic piracy, and a critical source of intelligence on the shifting politics of the Italian mainland. The relationship was codified through a series of imperial decrees and grants. Venetian merchants were given privileged access to the markets of the Byzantine Empire, allowing them to trade within the vast imperial network under the protection of the emperor's authority. Their leaders, initially military tribunes appointed by the exarch, gradually gained the right to elect their own dux, or doge, a term derived from the Byzantine military title. The emperor, in turn, would ratify this election, bestowing upon the doge coveted imperial honorifics, such as Hypatus or Protos Pytharios. These titles, while seemingly symbolic, were of immense practical value, granting the Venetian leader a recognized diplomatic standing in his negotiations with other powers. This arrangement fostered a carefully cultivated ambiguity. To the emperor in Constantinople, the Venetians were loyal, if distant and troublesome, subjects. To their mainland neighbours, they were representatives of imperial power, and to themselves, they were a de facto independent state, leveraging the prestige of a distant master to secure the freedom to pursue their own commercial and political destiny. The loose confederation of island communities, each governed by its own tribune, proved inherently unstable in the face of growing internal rivalries and persistent external threats. The commercial success that enriched the lagoon also fueled intense competition between the leading settlements of Heraclea, Malamocco, and Jesolo. These were not merely economic disputes, they were deep-seated factional conflicts, often exacerbated by ecclesiastical schisms and the competing ambitions of powerful families that frequently escalated into armed violence. This internal strife paralyzed the lagoon's ability to mount a unified defense against the ever-present dangers of Lombard encroachment from the mainland and Narentine pirate raids that preyed upon their vital shipping lanes. The authority of the distant Byzantine exarch in Ravenna was too remote and increasingly too feeble to effectively mediate these disputes or provide timely military assistance. The fragmented command structure, where each island's militia acted in its own interest, was dangerously inadequate for the strategic challenges of the late 7th century. The realization grew among the leading families that survival required a radical political innovation, the consolidation of military and civic authority into the hands of a single, lifelong executive. According to long-held tradition, this pivotal moment occurred in 697 AD at a general assembly, or Concio, where the assembled freemen of the lagoon elected Paolo Lucio Anafesto of Heraclea as their first dux, or doge. While the historicity of both the date and Anafesto himself is debated by modern scholars, with the first historically verifiable doge, Orso Ipato, appearing in records several decades later, the traditional account represents a foundational truth about the Republic's origins. The creation of the dogeship was a pragmatic solution to existential chaos. It was a deliberate act of political self-determination, designed to subordinate factional interests to the common good. This new leader was not a king in the feudal sense. He held no hereditary title and owned no land by right of office. He was the chief magistrate and commander-in-chief of a commonwealth, elected for life to provide stability and unified command. This act was the first definitive step in forging a distinct Venetian political identity, a move away from being a disparate collection of Byzantine outposts and toward becoming a cohesive, self-governing state. Although his election still required nominal ratification from Constantinople to maintain the vital imperial connection, the locus of power had decisively shifted to the lagoon itself. The consolidation of internal power under the Doge was a prerequisite for confronting the existential threat that lay beyond the lagoon's protective shoals. The Adriatic Sea, the very source of Venice's nascent wealth, was a lawless frontier. Its eastern coastline, a labyrinth of islands and hidden coves, provided the perfect sanctuary for the Narentine pirates, Slavic tribes who preyed relentlessly upon the Republic's merchant shipping. Their attacks were not random acts of brigandage, but a systematic disruption of the vital trade routes to the Levant and Constantinople. Simultaneously, Saracen raiders, operating from bases in Sicily and the southern Italian coast, launched larger, more destructive expeditions into the northern Adriatic, threatening not just commerce, but the lagoon settlements themselves. For a state with no agrarian hinterland, whose entire existence was predicated on the secure flow of maritime commerce, this piracy was not a mere nuisance, but a mortal danger. The strategic imperative was absolute: control the sea or perish. This necessity drove the early and rapid professionalization of the Venetian navy. Shipwrights in the burgeoning arsenal, the state-run shipyard, began to differentiate between broad-beamed cargo ships or naves and the development of specialized warships. They perfected the design of the Gallia Sotile, a slender, oar-powered war galley engineered for speed and maneuverability, perfectly suited to the hit-and-run tactics required for anti-piracy warfare. The early campaigns of the 9th and 10th centuries were primarily punitive expeditions. Doges like Pietro Tredonico led fleets not to conquer territory, but to hunt down and destroy pirate flotillas and their coastal strongholds. These were brutal, attritional campaigns that aimed to make the cost of piracy prohibitively high. The turning point came under the leadership of Doge Pietro II Orseolo. In a decisive campaign around the year 1000 AD, he led a massive fleet down the Dalmatian coast, systematically shattering the power of the Narentines. His victory was so complete that he was able to compel the major Dalmatian city-states, including Zara and Spalato, to swear fealty to Venice in exchange for protection. Upon his triumphant return, Pietro II Orseolo assumed the title Dux Dalmatiae, Duke of Dalmatia, a clear and unprecedented declaration of Venetian sovereignty beyond the lagoon. This was the first foundational act in the creation of Venice's overseas empire, the Stato de Mar. The taming of the Adriatic was the crucible in which Venetian naval doctrine was forged, and its imperial destiny first articulated. For a republic built on maritime prowess and commercial acumen, spiritual legitimacy remained a glaring deficiency. While Venice was growing in wealth, it lacked the apostolic prestige of ancient seas like Rome, or the patriarchal authority of its mainland rival, Aquileia. Its original patron, the Byzantine warrior Saint Theodore, was a borrowed, second-tier figure, inadequate for a state cultivating an identity of exceptionalism and independence from its imperial protector. An opportunity to rectify this deficit arose in 828 AD, within the complex political landscape of Abbasid-controlled Egypt. Two Venetian merchants, Buono de Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello, were trading in Alexandria when they learned of the Coptic Christian community's growing fear that the local governor intended to desecrate the church holding the sacred relics of St. Mark the Evangelist. The acquisition of such a preeminent relic was a prize of incalculable value. Acting with a characteristic blend of piety and audacious pragmatism, the two merchants conspired with the local priests to execute a translatio, a holy theft. The act was one of meticulous planning and subterfuge. They exhumed the saint's body, substituting the remains of a lesser saint to placate the tomb's guardians. To ensure safe passage through the Muslim-controlled port, they concealed the relics in a large basket, covering them with a layer of pork, a substance ritually unclean to Muslims, thereby repelling any close inspection by customs officials. The plan succeeded, and the merchants set sail for the lagoon with their sacred cargo. The arrival of the relics in Venice was an event of transformative significance, met with a choreographed display of public rejoicing and religious ceremony, orchestrated by Doge Giustiniano Partecipazio. Overnight, Venice was elevated from a provincial duchy to a pilgrimage destination of the first rank. Saint Mark, an evangelist and author of a canonical gospel, provided Venice with a patron of apostolic authority, one who had, according to tradition, been a disciple of Saint Peter himself. This directly challenged Rome's Petrine claims and provided a theological foundation for Venetian ecclesiastical independence. The winged lion, the traditional symbol of Saint Mark, was immediately adopted as the emblem of the Venetian state. The Republic became the Republic of Saint Mark. This was not merely a change in patronage, but a fundamental redefinition of the state's identity. The construction of the first Basilica di San Marco began almost immediately, a magnificent new chapel attached to the Doge's palace, physically and symbolically fusing the spiritual and political hearts of the Republic. The Furtum Sacrum, or sacred theft, provided the divine mandate for Venice's imperial destiny, framing future commercial expansion and military conquest as acts undertaken in the service and under the protection of its powerful new patron. The late 10th and early 11th centuries were dominated by the Orseolo family, a dynasty whose ambition fundamentally reshaped the nature of ducal power and Venetian foreign policy. Moving beyond the reactive, defensive posture of their predecessors, doges like Pietro I, and particularly his son, Pietro II Orseolo, initiated a proactive strategy of commercial and political expansion. They consolidated the authority of the Doge, transforming the office from a chief magistracy into the hereditary possession of a powerful clan, capable of directing the state's resources toward long-term strategic goals. With the Adriatic piracy largely suppressed following the Dalmatian campaigns, Pietro II Orseolo turned his attention eastward, recognizing that the Republic's future prosperity depended not just on secure transit, but on preferential access to the immense markets of the Byzantine Empire. The critical breakthrough was diplomatic, not military. In 992 AD, Pietro II secured a landmark treaty from the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, a golden bull or crucible, that granted Venetian merchants unprecedented commercial privileges. This imperial decree was the legal cornerstone of Venice's commercial empire. It drastically reduced customs duties for Venetian traders, lowering them to a fraction of what their Genoese and Pisan rivals paid, and granted them legal protections and expedited judicial proceedings in Byzantine courts. This gave Venice a decisive, state-sanctioned competitive advantage in the most lucrative markets of the known world. The crucible was not merely a trade agreement, it was a license for economic dominance. Its immediate consequence was the formal establishment of the first Venetian commercial enclaves in the great cities of the Levant. In Constantinople itself, the Venetians were granted a dedicated quarter, a fondico, along the Golden Horn. This was more than a marketplace. It was a sovereign Venetian outpost within the imperial capital, complete with its own warehouses, docks, living quarters, chapels, and a magistrate, the bailo, who exercised legal authority over the Venetian residents. Similar outposts were soon established in other key ports, like Antioch and Tyre. The Orseolo dynasty, through a shrewd combination of naval supremacy in the Adriatic and deft diplomacy in Constantinople, had successfully projected Venetian power deep into the eastern Mediterranean. They had laid the permanent commercial infrastructure for the Stato da Mar, ensuring that the flow of silks, spices, and other luxury goods from the east would pass through Venetian hands, funding the Republic's inexorable rise. The rapid consolidation of Norman power in southern Italy and Sicily during the 11th century introduced a political and military force of unprecedented ambition into the central Mediterranean. Unlike the localized threats of pirates, the Norman kingdoms, under aggressive leaders like Robert Guiscard, possessed a sophisticated, feudal military machine and territorial ambitions that extended across the Adriatic. Their primary strategic objective was the conquest of Byzantine territories in the Balkans, a direct assault on the integrity of the Eastern Roman Empire, and a mortal threat to the Venetian sea lanes that constituted the Republic's economic lifeline. This shared danger forged an urgent military alliance between Venice and Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire, possessing a formidable land army but a diminished fleet, was incapable of challenging the Normans at sea. The Republic of St. Mark was the only power with the naval capacity to counter the Norman fleets and secure the vital maritime corridors. In exchange for this indispensable service, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos issued a new golden bull in 1082. This decree expanded upon the earlier Orseolo-era privileges, granting Venetian merchants complete exemption from all taxes and customs duties throughout the empire, and assigning them an even larger, more privileged quarter in Constantinople. It effectively made Venice the exclusive economic intermediary between the Byzantine East and the Latin West. The ensuing naval wars were a series of brutal, large-scale conflicts that tested the Venetian fleet to its limits. The campaigns centered on the strategic port of Durazzo, the gateway to the Balkans. Here, the Venetian navy, under the personal command of Doge Domenico Selvo, engaged in pitched battles against Norman fleets supporting Guiscard's land-based siege. These were not anti-piracy skirmishes, but sophisticated naval engagements between two professional military forces. The Venetians deployed innovative tactics, including the use of Greek fire, supplied by their Byzantine allies, and the construction of floating siege towers. The struggle was protracted and immensely costly, with victories and defeats on both sides, but the Venetian fleet's persistence was decisive. They successfully broke Norman blockades, resupplied the besieged city, and ultimately crippled Guiscard's naval capabilities, forcing the abandonment of his most ambitious Balkan campaign. This conflict solidified the Republic's reputation as the premier naval power of the era and fundamentally altered its relationship with Byzantium, transforming it from a semi-autonomous client into an indispensable and increasingly powerful military partner. The naval supremacy demonstrated against the Normans was not sustained by ad hoc measures, but by the creation of a revolutionary industrial complex, the Venetian arsenal. Traditionally founded in 1104, its establishment was a calculated response to the strategic realities of the 12th century. The Republic's survival and prosperity depended on its ability to project naval power on a scale that private decentralized shipyards, known as squarii, could no longer guarantee. The state required a centralized facility capable of constructing and maintaining warships with unprecedented speed and standardization. Located in the Castello district, the arsenal grew into the largest single industrial enterprise in pre-industrial Europe, a vast walled complex of shipyards, armories, and workshops that became the engine of Venetian maritime dominance. The key to its unparalleled efficiency was the systematic application of mass production principles centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Hulls, masts, rudders, benches, and oars were produced as standardized, interchangeable components and stockpiled in immense warehouses. When a new fleet was required, the process resembled a modern assembly line. A bare hull would enter the main canal, the Rio dell'Arsenal, and be towed past a series of workshops. Specialized guilds of workers, the arsenalotti, would descend upon the vessel in a meticulously choreographed sequence, each team responsible for a single task. Caulkers sealed the hull, carpenters fitted the masts and rowing benches, and riggers installed the ropes and sails. The process was so refined that a war galley could be fully assembled, armed, and provisioned in a matter of hours. This industrial capacity was vertically integrated. The arsenal was a self-contained ecosystem, encompassing the Tana, the state rope factory that produced cordage of legendary quality, alongside foundries for casting cannons, forges for anchors and iron fittings, and vast armories. The Republic controlled the entire supply chain, from the oak forests it managed in Dalmatia to the hemp fields of the Italian mainland. The workforce, the arsenalotti, formed a privileged, hereditary caste of over 16 zero-skilled craftsmen who were the highest-paid laborers in Venice. Their loyalty to the state was absolute, secured by lifelong employment, pensions, and social benefits. This formidable institution was the true foundation of the Stato da Mar, granting Venice a strategic advantage no rival could match: the ability to generate naval power on an industrial scale. The indispensable naval support provided against the Normans was not an act of simple allegiance, but a calculated strategic investment that Venice leveraged for unparalleled economic gain. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, facing the existential threat of Norman invasion and possessing a critically weakened fleet, was in no position to refuse the Republic's terms. The result was the Golden Bull, or Chrysobull, of 1082, a document that stands as one of the most significant diplomatic and commercial triumphs in medieval history. This imperial decree was not merely an extension of previous agreements, but a fundamental restructuring of economic power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Its central provision granted Venetian merchants complete and total exemption from the Commercium, the standard 10% tax levied on all trade within the Byzantine Empire. This single clause conferred upon Venice a structural economic advantage of immense proportions, allowing them to undercut all competitors, including their burgeoning maritime rivals from Genoa and Pisa, who continued to pay the full duties. The decree went further, assigning the Venetians an enlarged and more strategically located quarter in Constantinople itself. This district, situated along the vital Golden Horn, was granted extensive docking facilities, warehouses, and even bakeries, effectively creating a self-sufficient commercial colony at the heart of the imperial capital. It was a sovereign enclave, administered not by Byzantine officials, but by a Venetian magistrate, the Bailo, who held legal jurisdiction over all Venetian citizens residing there. The Golden Bull also bestowed upon the Doge the imperial title of Protozabastos, a high honor that elevated his status among foreign rulers and symbolically cemented the Republic's unique relationship with the empire. The consequences were immediate and profound. The flow of luxury goods, silks from China, spices from the Indies, alum from Anatolia, was systematically diverted into Venetian hands. The Republic became the exclusive tollgate for the most lucrative trade routes in the world, accumulating capital on a scale previously unimaginable. This immense wealth directly financed the expansion of the arsenal and the professionalization of the fleet, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of commercial and military power. The Golden Bull was the legal charter for Venice's commercial empire, a diplomatic masterstroke that transformed the Republic from a favored trading partner into the de facto economic arbiter of the Byzantine world, and set the stage for its imperial ascendancy. The acquisition of St. Mark's relics necessitated the creation of a physical structure worthy of housing an apostle, an undertaking that would define the Republic's architectural identity. The construction of the first Basilica di San Marco, begun shortly after 828 and consecrated in 832, was a profound political and theological statement. Its design was not based on the Latin basilicas of the Italian mainland, but was a direct emulation of the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, one of the most important sanctuaries in the Byzantine Empire. This choice was a calculated assertion of parity. By adopting an imperial model, Venice claimed for itself a sacred authority and apostolic legitimacy that rivaled that of the Eastern Emperor. The original structure was a brick-built Greek cross, crowned by 5 distinct domes, a composition that was entirely alien to Western Christendom at the time, and served as an unambiguous visual declaration of Venice's deep-rooted orientation toward the East. Adjacent to this new religious heart, the original Doge's Palace, or Palazzo Ducale, was conceived not as a residence, but as a fortress. It was a formidable, moated castle with massive corner towers and crenellated walls, reflecting the precarious nature of ducal authority in an era of intense internal factionalism and external threats. The palace was physically connected to the basilica, forming a single, integrated complex that fused secular and spiritual power into one indivisible nucleus. This was the tangible center of the Venetian state, where the Doge, as head of government, could move seamlessly from his fortified seat of power into the state church that legitimized his rule. The resulting architectural ensemble created a unique visual language. The Byzantine domes and plan of the basilica spoke of imperial ambition and sophisticated Eastern culture, while the heavy, fortified classicism of the palace asserted military strength and feudal authority, in a language understood by the Lombard and Frankish powers of the West. This deliberate fusion of styles was the physical embodiment of Venice's unique geopolitical position, a republic that navigated the currents between two worlds, drawing its cultural and spiritual inspiration from Byzantium, while projecting its military and political power into the Latin West. The very fabric of these buildings, incorporating precious marbles and capitals brought by sea, became a testament to the Republic's growing maritime reach. The summons for the First Crusade, issued by Pope Urban II in 1095, was met in Venice not with immediate religious fervour, but with a period of deliberate and pragmatic observation. While the land-based armies of Western feudalism marched eastward, the Republic initially withheld its formidable naval assets, assessing the expedition's viability as a strategic and commercial enterprise. Only after the Crusaders had achieved initial successes and demonstrated their capacity to seize territory did Venice commit, its intervention shaped by a precise economic calculus rather than pure piety. The Venetian contribution, when it finally materialized in 1099 with a fleet of over 200 ships, was not conceived as an act of charity, but as a contractual service. The Republic's role became the logistical sine qua non for the survival and expansion of the nascent Crusader states. The land-bound Frankish knights were incapable of capturing the heavily fortified coastal cities of the Levant, Acre, Tyre, Sidon, which were essential for maintaining supply lines to Europe. Venetian naval blockades were the indispensable prerequisite for any successful siege. This critical leverage was not offered freely. For each major engagement, Venetian diplomats negotiated explicit treaties that stipulated the exact price of their participation. The terms were consistently advantageous, typically demanding a third of any conquered city, complete exemption from all taxes and tolls within the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the establishment of autonomous Venetian quarters. These enclaves were not mere trading posts. They were sovereign commercial colonies, each possessing its own church, bakery, marketplace, and legal court operating under Venetian law. The Pactum Warmundi of 1123, negotiated for assistance in the capture of Tyre, stands as the archetypal example of this policy, granting Venice extensive legal and commercial privileges throughout the Crusader kingdom. Through this strategy, Venice systematically constructed a chain of fortified, revenue-generating entrepôts across the entire Levantine seaboard. While the Frankish nobility expended blood and treasure to govern a precarious kingdom, the Republic secured permanent, tax-free commercial hubs that became the eastern anchors of its trade empire, ensuring that the vast wealth of the Silk Road and the spice trade flowed exclusively through its coffers. The strategic calculus that defined Venetian participation in the Crusades reached its apotheosis in the campaign to capture Tyre. By the 1120s, the port remained the last major Fatimid Egyptian stronghold on the Levantine coast, a formidable naval base that projected hostile sea power, threatened Christian shipping, and undermined the security of the entire Kingdom of Jerusalem. Its reduction was a paramount strategic objective for the landlocked Frankish nobility. The opportunity for Venice to intervene arose from a major state-sponsored expedition, the Venetian Crusade of 1122-1124, personally commanded by Doge Domenico Michiel. This was not a mercenary venture, but a full-scale deployment of the Republic's military and economic might. After a series of naval victories against the Egyptian fleet, Michiel's armada arrived off Tyre in early 1124 to find a Crusader army already engaged in a faltering land-based siege. The city's formidable defences, which had repulsed previous assaults, were rendered vulnerable by the immediate imposition of a total Venetian naval blockade. This action severed Tyre's maritime lifeline to Egypt, cutting off all possibility of reinforcement, resupply, or escape. The Venetian fleet did more than passively contain the port. It became an active participant in the assault. Engineers constructed siege towers and catapults, mounting them on naval platforms to bombard the city's formidable sea walls, a display of coordinated amphibious warfare that was beyond the capabilities of any other contemporary naval power. The relentless pressure from both land and sea, sustained over 5 months, systematically eroded the garrison's will to resist. In July 1124, the city's defenders negotiated a surrender. The terms of the subsequent division were not improvised, but were the direct implementation of the Pactum Warmundi. Venice received immediate possession of 1/3 of the city and its associated agricultural territories, an endowment that included a guaranteed 300 bezants annually from the city's revenues. Within this new sovereign quarter, the Republic established its own administration, courts, and commercial infrastructure, creating a permanent, self-governing Venetian colony inside the most valuable port in the Crusader states, thereby securing a direct and unassailable gateway to the markets of the interior. The election of Enrico Dandolo to the Dogeship in 1192 represented a deliberate choice by the Venetian oligarchy for a figure of immense experience and uncompromising will. Ascending to power at an age exceeding 80 years and functionally blind, his physical infirmities were considered subordinate to his unparalleled record of diplomatic service and his profound, first-hand understanding of the Byzantine court. Dandolo's career had been forged in the crucible of late 12th century geopolitics, a period marked by escalating tensions with Constantinople. He had personally witnessed the growing unreliability of the Byzantine emperors and likely endured diplomatic humiliations during his time as an envoy, events which cultivated in him a deep-seated and strategically calculated animosity towards the Eastern Empire. His leadership was immediately characterized by decisive internal reforms that strengthened the fiscal and legal foundations of the Republic. One of his most significant early acts was the introduction of the silver grosso, a coin of high and consistent purity that rapidly became the standard currency for international trade throughout the Mediterranean, enhancing Venice's economic leverage. Simultaneously, he formalized the ducal oath, the Promissio Ducale, transforming it into a binding constitutional document that precisely defined the powers and limitations of his office, thereby reinforcing the state's collective authority over the individual ruler. Dandolo's vision extended far beyond domestic administration. He perceived that the system of negotiated privileges, such as the Golden Bull, was an inherently fragile basis for Venetian prosperity. The violent anti-Latin pogroms in Constantinople, most notably the massacre of 1182, had demonstrated that imperial favour could be lethally withdrawn at any moment. From his perspective, long-term security required a fundamental restructuring of the Eastern Mediterranean's political landscape. This meant transitioning from a policy of securing commercial rights within the Byzantine framework to one of acquiring direct, sovereign control over the strategic maritime nodes that constituted the Republic's trade network. His advanced age was not a sign of weakness, but rather of accumulated political capital and a lifetime of strategic thought, positioning him as a leader uniquely prepared to exploit any opportunity to advance Venice's interests, no matter how audacious the required course of action. The arrangement for the Fourth Crusade, finalized in 1201, was the largest military transport contract in medieval history. The French nobility, leaders of the expedition, contracted with the Venetian Republic for the conveyance of 33 500 crusaders and 4 500 horses to Egypt. To fulfill this obligation, Venice suspended its entire commercial apparatus for over a year, dedicating the full capacity of the arsenal to construct a purpose-built fleet of warships and transports. The arrival of the Crusader army in the summer of 202 precipitated an immediate crisis. Instead of the contracted number, only about 12 soldiers mustered on the Lido, leaving the crusade leaders unable to pay the agreed-upon sum of 85 silver marks. This shortfall created a catastrophic financial liability for Venice, which had already expended immense capital on the fleet's construction and provisioning. With a massive idle army encamped on their shores and a ruinous contract in default, Enrico Dandolo proposed a pragmatic solution. He offered to defer the outstanding debt if the Crusaders would assist Venice in retaking the rebellious city of Zara, a Catholic Hungarian possession on the Dalmatian coast. Despite fierce opposition from some Crusaders and an explicit prohibition from Pope Innocent III against attacking a Christian city, the army's leaders, trapped by their financial obligations, consented. The successful siege and sack of Zara in November 1202 resulted in the excommunication of the entire crusade, yet it critically established a precedent for using the Holy Army as an instrument of Venetian foreign policy. It was during the winter encampment at Zara that a second, more consequential diversion was proposed. Envoys arrived from the exiled Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, who offered the Crusaders a staggering reward if they would sail to Constantinople and restore his deposed father, Isaac II Angelos, to the throne. His terms were precisely tailored to the Crusades' predicaments. He would pay off their entire remaining debt to Venice, finance their subsequent campaign in the Holy Land, provide an army of 10 Byzantine soldiers for the cause, and, most crucially, submit the entire Eastern Orthodox Church to papal authority. For Dandolo, this proposition was the culmination of a lifetime of strategic ambition, an unparalleled opportunity to shatter Byzantine power and replace it with a compliant Latin regime, thereby securing Venetian maritime supremacy in perpetuity. The arrival of the Crusader Venetian fleet before the Theodosian walls in June 1203 initiated a sequence of events that culminated in the destruction of the Byzantine capital. The initial assault successfully restored the deposed Isaac II and his son Alexios IV to the throne, but their hold on power was tenuous and their treasury empty. The promises made at Zara proved impossible to fulfill. The anti-Latin sentiment within the city made raising the vast sums pledged to the Crusaders politically suicidal, and Alexios IV's attempts to do so by melting down religious icons only fueled internal dissent. By early 1204, relations had completely collapsed. Alexios IV was murdered in a palace coup, and the Crusaders, now viewed as a hostile occupying force, resolved to take the city for themselves. The final siege began in April 1204, with the decisive assault focused not on the formidable land walls, but on the weaker sea walls along the Golden Horn, a sector where Venetian naval expertise was paramount. Venetian galleys were modified into amphibious assault platforms, their flying bridges allowing marines to engage defenders directly on the battlements. On April 12th, after an initial attack was repulsed, a coordinated Venetian assault breached the walls in multiple locations. Doge Enrico Dandolo, despite his age and blindness, stood on the prow of his galley, the banner of St. Mark unfurled, personally directing the attack and threatening to execute any man who faltered. The breach triggered a catastrophic collapse of the city's defences. What followed was a 3-day sack of unimaginable brutality and scale. While the Frankish Crusaders engaged in largely indiscriminate looting and destruction, the Venetian approach was systematic and strategic. Their plunder was not random but a calculated state-level acquisition of assets. Special contingents were dispatched to secure the city's most valuable treasures. The triumphal quadriga, the 4 bronze horses from the hippodrome, was carefully dismantled and shipped to Venice to adorn the facade of St. Mark's. Countless religious relics, including fragments of the True Cross and the body of St. Athanasius, were seized from churches and monasteries, their acquisition representing an immense transfer of spiritual capital. The sack destroyed centuries of accumulated art, literature, and knowledge, and resulted in the permanent fragmentation of the Byzantine Empire, an act from which Eastern Christendom would never fully recover. The formal division of the conquered Byzantine state was codified in the Partitio Terrarum Imperii Romaniae in October 1204, a treaty that stands as a foundational document of Venetian imperialism. The Republic, as the primary enabler of the conquest, was entitled to a significant share, yet its selections were a masterpiece of strategic calculation. Foregoing large, difficult-to-govern inland territories, which were left to the new Latin emperor and Frankish lords, Venice methodically claimed a chain of ports, islands, and coastal strips essential for maritime control. This network of possessions formed the Stato de Mar, or the sea state, an empire designed not for territorial aggrandizement, but for the absolute domination of trade routes. In accordance with the treaty, Doge Enrico Dandolo and his successors adopted the title Dominator Quartae Partis et Dimidiae Totius Imperii Romaniae, Lord of a quarter and 1/2 of a quarter of the Roman Empire, a direct reference to the 3/8 of the Byzantine territories now under Venetian sovereignty. The acquisitions were meticulously chosen. The Republic secured direct control over the most crucial harbours of the Peloponnese, notably Modon and Coron, which became the vital eyes of the Republic, serving as indispensable refitting and resupply stations for all shipping convoys travelling to the Levant. The most significant prize was the island of Crete, known as Candia, whose conquest and subjugation would become a multi-generational project, but whose strategic position and agricultural output made it the linchpin of Venetian power in the eastern Mediterranean. Further north, the island of Euboea, or Negroponte, along with the Cyclades and Sporades, were also partitioned. Rather than administering all these territories directly, which would have been a massive drain on the state's resources, Venice implemented a system of feudal colonialism. Many of the Aegean islands were granted as fiefdoms to ambitious Venetian noble families, such as the Sanudo clan who established the Duchy of the Archipelago. These private colonial ventures effectively outsourced the cost of conquest and administration, while creating a network of loyal dependencies that secured the sea lanes for Venetian commerce and projected the Republic's naval power throughout the Aegean. The aftermath of the Fourth Crusade endowed Venice with an empire, but the internal political challenge was to ensure that no single individual or family could ever leverage that power for personal gain. The 12th and 13th centuries were therefore defined by a systematic and deliberate process of constitutional engineering designed to diffuse authority and prevent the rise of a despot. Central to this evolution was the Great Council, the Maggior Consiglio, which was formalized as the sovereign assembly of the Republic, possessing the ultimate authority to elect all major magistrates and approve legislation. Initially an open body, its composition was irrevocably altered by the series of acts known as the Serrata del Maggior Consiglio, or the closing of the Great Council, culminating in 1297. This constitutional reform effectively closed membership to a hereditary patriciate, restricting eligibility to those families whose paternal ancestors had previously sat on the council. This act created a permanent, closed-caste aristocracy and laid the foundation for centuries of oligarchic rule, ensuring that state power remained a collective enterprise of the nobility. To manage the increasingly complex affairs of the expanding state, a more nimble executive body was required. This led to the empowerment of the Senate, or Consiglio dei Pregadi, a council of approximately 120 members responsible for foreign policy, military affairs, and commerce. The Senate debated treaties, appointed ambassadors, and authorized naval expeditions, serving as the primary engine of Venetian foreign policy. The power of the Doge, once nearly absolute, was progressively curtailed through a series of ingenious constitutional checks. Upon election, every new Doge was required to swear a detailed oath, the Promissione Ducale, which was meticulously revised before each election to address the perceived excesses of the previous incumbent. This document strictly defined the limits of his authority, regulated his personal finances, and forbade him from conducting foreign policy or meeting with ambassadors without the presence of his ducal councillors. These councillors, elected by the Great Council, were a constant presence, effectively placing the head of state under permanent committee supervision and ensuring that his actions always reflected the collective will of the aristocracy rather than his personal ambition. The intricate system of checks and balances, designed to preserve the aristocratic republic, faced its most severe internal test in 1310 with the conspiracy led by the nobleman Bajamonte Tiepolo. The plot, a well-organized attempt to assassinate the Doge and seize control of the state, was foiled only at the last moment by a combination of informants and fortunate happenstance. The failed coup sent a shockwave through the Venetian patriciate, revealing the vulnerability of the state to internal treason and the inadequacy of its existing judicial bodies, which were considered too slow, public, and procedurally complex to counter such existential threats. In the immediate aftermath, as the conspirators were hunted down and executed, the Great Council took the extraordinary step of creating a special tribunal with emergency powers to investigate the plot and its ramifications. This body, intended as a temporary committee of public safety, was composed of 10 members elected from the Great Council. Its initial mandate was limited, but the perceived persistence of internal threats led to repeated extensions of its authority until, in 1335, it was declared a permanent organ of the state. The Council of Ten. The Consiglio dei Dieci operated as the Republic's supreme instrument of state security, an enigmatic and feared institution whose authority transcended all other legal and political structures. Its membership, which included the Doge and his 6 councillors in addition to the 10 elected patricians, was subject to strict regulations to prevent corruption, with members serving 1-year terms and being ineligible for immediate re-election. The council was granted sweeping powers to act in secret, utilizing its own budget, maintaining a network of spies and informants both at home and abroad, and conducting trials in camera. It could issue sentences, including exile, confiscation of property, and capital punishment, without public process or the right of appeal. Its methods became legendary, relying on a system of anonymous denunciations, or denunzi segrete, which could be deposited into stone letterboxes, the Bosch di Leone, placed strategically around the city. This created an atmosphere of pervasive suspicion, where the state's intelligence apparatus seemed omnipresent, capable of reaching into the most private affairs of any citizen, regardless of their rank. The commercial empire established after 1204 inevitably brought Venice into direct and sustained conflict with its primary maritime competitor, the Republic of Genoa. This was not a clash of ideologies, but a protracted struggle between 2 powers with identical economic models, both dependent on dominating the same sea lanes and monopolizing access to the same eastern markets. The rivalry, ignited in the mid-13th century with the War of St. Sabas, fought over control of commercial quarters in Acre, but quickly escalated into a Mediterranean-wide conflict for commercial hegemony. The Genoese, having been sidelined by the outcome of the Fourth Crusade, strategically allied themselves with the restored Byzantine Empire under the Treaty of Nymphaeum in 1261, gaining preferential access to Black Sea trade and challenging Venice's post-1204 dominance. This set the stage for a series of exhausting naval wars characterized by large-scale galley battles, commercial raiding, and the blockading of vital ports from the Aegean to the Sea of Azov. The conflict reached its definitive climax in the War of Chioggia, which began in 1378. In a brilliant and daring naval campaign, a Genoese fleet, under the command of Admiral Pietro Doria, succeeded in capturing the town of Chioggia, a key port at the southern entrance of the Venetian lagoon itself. For the first time, an enemy fleet was anchored within sight of the Doge's palace, posing an existential threat to the Republic's survival. The initial Venetian response was disastrous, leading to the imprisonment of their own admiral Vetta Pisani. Yet, in this moment of ultimate crisis, the Venetian state demonstrated its resilience. Pisani was released by popular demand, and a desperate counteroffensive was launched. The Venetians methodically blockaded the Genoese fleet inside the Chioggia harbour, sinking block ships at the narrow channel entrances. A war of attrition ensued throughout the harsh winter of 1381, a siege in which the besiegers themselves were besieged. The eventual arrival of a Venetian relief fleet under Carlo Zeno sealed the fate of the trapped Genoese. In June 1381, the starved and defeated Genoese forces surrendered unconditionally. While the subsequent Treaty of Turin was not overtly punitive, the war had exhausted Genoa's financial and naval resources, leading to a period of internal political instability from which it would never fully recover its former stature. Venice, though severely battered, had eliminated its greatest rival and secured its maritime supremacy for the next century. While the Republic solidified its maritime dominion through naval warfare, a parallel expansion of Venetian influence was occurring through the overland ventures of its most enterprising merchant families. The Polo family, already experienced in the Black Sea trade, embarked on a journey that would fundamentally alter Europe's understanding of the global landscape. The brothers Niccolo and Maffeo Polo had already completed one trading expedition to the east, returning to Venice in 1269, with a request from the Mongol ruler Kublai Khan for 100 learned men and oil from the lamp at the Holy Sepulchre. In 1271, they set out again from Venice, this time accompanied by Niccolo's 17-year-old son Marco. Their journey was not merely commercial but also diplomatic, carrying letters from Pope Gregory X to the Great Khan. The overland trek took them more than 3 years, traversing the vast territories of the Mongol Empire along the Silk Road. Upon their arrival at the Khan's summer palace at Chengdu, they were received into the imperial court. Marco, in particular, impressed Kublai Khan with his intelligence and linguistic abilities, entering into the Khan's service for the next 17 years. This official position afforded him an unprecedented opportunity to travel throughout the Mongol domains on various administrative and fact-finding missions. His travels took him through Cathay China, into Tibet, and possibly as far as Burma, providing him with first-hand observations of a civilization far more populous and technologically advanced than any in Europe. He documented the empire's sophisticated bureaucracy, its use of paper currency, the efficiency of its imperial postal system, and the vast commercial activity in its cities. After leaving the Khan's court in 1292, the Polos returned to Venice in 1295, having been absent for 24 years. A few years later, during a naval conflict with Genoa, Marco Polo was captured and imprisoned. It was during this Genoese captivity that he dictated the account of his travels to a fellow prisoner, the Pisan writer Rustichello. The resulting manuscript, known as The Travels of Marco Polo, became one of the most influential books of the Middle Ages. Though met with some skepticism, it provided Europe with its most comprehensive and detailed description of Asia to date. It was a practical account of geography, trade goods, and cultural practices that profoundly influenced European cartography and inspired future generations of explorers, solidifying in the European mind the image of Venice as the indispensable gateway to the immense wealth of the Orient. The Republic's commercial supremacy was not built solely on ships and colonial outposts. It rested upon a sophisticated financial architecture that commanded the confidence of the entire known world. The cornerstone of this system was laid in 1284, when Doge Giovanni Dandolo authorized the minting of a new gold coin, the ducat. This was a strategic move to compete with the established Florentine florin and to create a currency that reflected Venice's growing economic power. The Venetian state guaranteed the ducat's integrity with a rigor that became legendary. Each coin was struck from 3.545 grams of 99.47% pure gold, a standard of fineness that the Zecca, the state mint, would maintain without deviation for over 500 years. This unwavering consistency transformed the ducat from a mere medium of exchange into an international standard of value, a trusted benchmark against which other currencies were measured. From the trading posts of the Levant to the markets of Flanders, merchants accepted the Venetian ducat without hesitation, drastically reducing the friction and risk of long-distance commerce. This monetary stability, enabled the development of financial innovations that were centuries ahead of their time. The Rialto district evolved into Europe's preeminent financial centre, where private bankers, the Banchi di Scritta, facilitated transactions through a system of book transfers. A merchant could pay a debt by having a sum debited from his account and credited to another's, eliminating the need to physically transport bulky and vulnerable chests of coin. This system was the direct precursor to the modern checking account. Building on this foundation, Venetian financiers perfected complex credit instruments. The bill of exchange allowed a merchant in Venice to finance a purchase in Alexandria with a written order, which could then be redeemed through a network of corresponding bankers, often in a different currency. This instrument not only facilitated the movement of capital across vast distances, but also created a sophisticated market for foreign exchange. To mitigate the immense risks of maritime trade, Venetian merchants systematized the practice of marine insurance. A ship owner or cargo investor could purchase a policy from a consortium of underwriters who, for a premium, would assume the financial loss in the event of shipwreck or piracy. The state regulated these contracts to ensure their enforceability, a crucial step that encouraged investment in the high-risk, high-reward ventures that were the lifeblood of the Republic. The intricate commercial network that sustained the Republic also rendered it uniquely vulnerable to the greatest demographic catastrophe of the medieval world. In the autumn of 1347, trading galleys returning from the Black Sea port of Caffa brought not just spices and silks, but the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The Black Death had arrived. The city's dense population, crowded into narrow calli and tightly packed housing, created ideal conditions for the plague's rapid transmission. The initial outbreak in the spring of 1348 was of a scale and virulence for which there was no precedent. Contemporary chroniclers describe a city gripped by terror, where social bonds dissolved in the face of overwhelming mortality. The death toll was catastrophic, with modern historical estimates suggesting that between 50 and 60% of the city's population perished within 18 months. The economic life of the Republic ground to a halt as workshops closed, banks failed, and international trade ceased. Yet, in the midst of this devastation, the Venetian state apparatus did not collapse. Instead, it engineered the world's first organized public health response. The Great Council, recognizing the inadequacy of existing measures, created a temporary council of 3 nobles tasked with coordinating the city's defense against the pestilence. This body implemented radical measures, including the isolation of the sick, the regulation of burials in mass graves on outlying islands, and the imposition of the first maritime quarantine. Ships arriving in the lagoon were required to anchor in isolation for a period of 40 days, 40 giorni, a term that would give the world its word for the practice. In 1423, responding to subsequent outbreaks, the Senate would formalize this system by establishing the first dedicated plague hospital, or lazaretto, on the island of Santa Maria di Nazareth. The plague's aftermath presented a new set of challenges. Severe labor shortages led to a dramatic rise in wages for surviving artisans and laborers, fundamentally altering the city's economic structure. To rebuild its demographic and economic base, the government enacted policies designed to attract immigrants, offering citizenship and tax incentives to skilled workers from across Italy and Germany. The catastrophe also led to a massive consolidation of wealth, as the estates of the dead were inherited by a smaller number of survivors, creating new fortunes and opportunities for social mobility. While the Black Death was an unprecedented disaster, the Republic's pragmatic and systematic response demonstrated the profound resilience of its institutions, laying the foundations for modern concepts of public health and ensuring the city's eventual recovery. Parallel to the formal political structure of the patriciate, the internal stability and economic vitality of the Republic were guaranteed by a complex and pervasive system of guilds, known as the school. These institutions were far more than simple trade associations. They were the fundamental organizing principle for the city's non-noble population, blending professional regulation, religious observance, and social welfare into a cohesive whole. The guilds were divided into two primary types: the arti, which governed specific crafts and trades, and the school, which were primarily devotional confraternities, although the two often overlapped. The arti meticulously regulated every aspect of production. State-appointed magistrates, such as the Justitia Vecchia, oversaw the guilds to ensure their statutes, or mariagole, aligned with the economic interests of the Republic. These statutes dictated everything from the training of apprentices and the promotion of journeymen to the quality of raw materials and the final price of finished goods. This rigid control was the secret to the legendary quality of Venetian manufactures. The glassmakers, for instance, were forcibly relocated to the island of Murano in 1291, a measure designed not only to reduce fire risk in the city, but also to closely guard the proprietary chemical formulas and techniques of their craft. Similarly, the weavers of luxury textiles produced silks, velvets, and brocades of a quality and design that were state-protected assets in international trade. Beyond professional life, the school provided a comprehensive social safety net. The 6 school grandi, or grand schools, were lay confraternities composed of wealthy citizens who engaged in vast charitable works, from distributing food and alms to providing dowries for impoverished girls and funding hospitals. The numerous school piccole, or minor schools, were typically tied to specific trades or immigrant communities, providing mutual support for their members. They cared for the sick, buried the dead, and supported the widows and orphans of deceased craftsmen. This system of organized charity was essential for maintaining social harmony, ensuring that even in a highly stratified society, the populace was cared for, thereby mitigating the potential for the popular unrest that plagued other Italian city-states. These institutions were also major patrons of the arts, commissioning magnificent meeting houses and chapels adorned with narrative painting cycles by artists like Vittore Carpaccio and Jacopo Tintoretto, visually cementing their importance within the city's sacred and civic landscape. The Republic's relationship with its Jewish population was a complex mixture of economic necessity and religious suspicion, a tension that found its ultimate expression in a pioneering act of urban segregation. Jewish communities, primarily German, Levantine, and later Spanish, had long been present in the city, but their status was precarious, governed by temporary charters or condotte that periodically came up for renewal. The volatile political climate of the early 16th century, particularly the social upheaval following the War of the League of Cambrai, brought an influx of Jewish refugees from the mainland, intensifying calls from popular preachers for their expulsion. The Venetian state, ever pragmatic, sought a solution that would appease public sentiment without sacrificing the vital economic functions the Jewish community performed. On March 29, 1516, the Senate issued a decree compelling all Jews living in Venice to reside within a designated enclosed area. The site chosen was a small island in the Cannaregio district, the location of the city's old copper foundry, known in the local dialect as the ghetto. This term would give the world a new word for forced segregation. The area, designated the Ghetto Nuovo, was physically isolated, its perimeter walled off, and its access limited to 2 bridges. By law, the gates were locked from sunset to sunrise, guarded by Christian watchmen whose salaries were levied upon the Jewish residents themselves. Furthermore, Jews were mandated to wear distinguishing insignia, initially a yellow circle, later a distinctive hat when moving about the city during the day. This act of confinement, however, was paradoxically coupled with a guarantee of protection. Within the ghetto's walls, the community was shielded from mob violence, and the Republic formally recognized their right to practice their religion. The state simultaneously codified their economic role, prohibiting them from entering the guilds or owning real estate, but sanctioning their crucial activities in money lending at state-regulated interest rates and the second-hand goods trade. This created a captive yet indispensable financial class. The ghetto quickly became one of the most densely populated areas of the city, with horizontal expansion impossible buildings were constructed upwards, creating some of Venice's first high-rise residential structures. Within this compressed space, a vibrant and complex society flourished, with distinct synagogues and cultural institutions established by the different Jewish ethnic groups, creating a world apart that was both a prison and a sanctuary. Long before the Republic's fortunes were built on the exotic luxuries of the East, its economic bedrock was a far more prosaic, yet strategically vital, commodity: salt. The control of salt production and distribution was not merely a lucrative business. It was a foundational instrument of state power, meticulously managed to generate immense revenue and enforce economic dependency throughout the Mediterranean. The Republic's mastery of the salt trade began in the salt pans, or saline, of the lagoon itself, particularly around Chioggia. The state systematically consolidated its control over these natural resources, transforming salt from a private enterprise into a rigorously enforced state monopoly overseen by a dedicated government body, the Magistrato al Sal. This salt magistracy became one of the most powerful and efficient branches of the Venetian bureaucracy, regulating production quotas, setting prices, and managing a complex logistical network of warehouses and transport fleets. The Republic's policy was ruthlessly simple. Any territory that fell under Venetian influence, whether through conquest or treaty, was compelled to purchase its salt exclusively from Venice. This was not a matter of market preference, but of law, a clause explicitly written into diplomatic and trade agreements. Cities on the Italian mainland, known as the terra firma, were prohibited from producing their own salt and were forced to import it from the lagoon at prices dictated by the magistracy. The resulting revenue stream was enormous, consistent, and less subject to the volatilities of long-distance maritime trade than spices or silks. This salt empire was a critical financial engine for the state, providing the capital necessary to fund the expansion of the arsenal, finance military campaigns, and pay the salaries of its vast administrative apparatus. The salt monopoly was also a potent political weapon. Venice could punish rebellious subject cities or recalcitrant allies by imposing a salt interdict, cutting off the supply of a preservative essential for food, industry, and human health. Conversely, it could reward loyalty with preferential pricing or increased quotas. This control over a basic necessity gave the Republic a form of leverage that was often more effective than direct military force, allowing it to project its power deep into the Italian hinterland and across the Adriatic, securing its dominance through economic coercion long before a single galley was deployed. The Republic's maritime dominance was constructed not only of timber and canvas from the arsenal, but also upon an equally sophisticated and indispensable framework of law. As its commercial reach extended, Venice developed a comprehensive body of maritime jurisprudence that was arguably its most influential export, creating a predictable legal environment that mitigated the immense risks of sea trade and became a model for the rest of Europe. This was not a single static code, but an evolving system of statutes, consular decisions, and customary practices codified over centuries. Its origins lay in pragmatic rulings on disputes between merchants, but by the mid-13th century, these had been consolidated into formal legal compilations, most notably the Statuti Maritimi under Doge Ranieri Zeno, around 1255. This body of law addressed every conceivable aspect of a maritime venture with meticulous detail. Central to its success was the formalization of the colleganza, or commenda, contract. This innovative business arrangement allowed for the pooling of capital by creating a limited partnership for a single voyage. A passive investor, the stands, would provide the majority of the capital, while a traveling merchant, the tractator, would conduct the voyage and the trade. Profits were typically split, with the investor receiving 3/4 and the merchant 1/4. But crucially, the investor's liability was limited to the capital they had provided. This legal instrument democratized investment beyond the great patrician families and fueled a massive expansion of commercial activity by spreading risk. The statutes also pioneered concepts that would become fundamental to international commercial law. They established clear regulations for maritime insurance, evolving from simple bottomry loans secured against the ship itself to complex policies covering the value of cargo against piracy, shipwreck, and other perils. The concept of general average, where all parties in a sea venture proportionally share any losses resulting from a voluntary sacrifice of part of the ship or cargo to save the whole, was precisely defined and enforced. Life aboard the ship was rigidly governed. The authority of the captain or patrono was immense, but it was also circumscribed by law, with defined responsibilities for the safety of the crew and cargo. Sailors' wages, duties, and disciplinary procedures were explicitly outlined, preventing arbitrary abuse and ensuring the orderly conduct of the vessel. Dedicated maritime courts, such as the Consoli dei Mercanti, were established in Venice and in its overseas colonies to adjudicate disputes swiftly and consistently, ensuring that Venetian law followed its merchants wherever they sailed, creating a reliable legal architecture for a globalized trading network. For centuries, the Republic had defined its existence by the sea, its gaze fixed eastward toward the markets of the Levant and the imperial court at Constantinople. The Italian mainland was a foreign landscape, a source of food and a terminus for trade, but not a territory to be possessed. This maritime-focused policy, however, became untenable in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, as the political consolidation of northern Italy, under ambitious seigneurial families, presented a direct existential threat. The expansionist policies of families like the Carrara of Padua and, more menacingly, the Visconti of Milan, threatened to encircle the lagoon, jeopardizing the overland trade routes through the Alpine passes and, critically, the Republic's grain supply. A Venice cut off from its mainland food source could be starved into submission without a single ship being sunk. This strategic vulnerability forced a reluctant and profound reorientation of Venetian foreign policy. The decision to expand onto the mainland, the terra firma, was one of the most contentious in the Republic's history, representing a fundamental break with its maritime identity. The initial catalyst was the aggression of Francesco Novello da Carrara, Lord of Padua, whose territorial ambitions directly threatened Venetian control of the rivers flowing into the lagoon. After a series of provocations, Venice launched a decisive war, culminating in the conquest of Padua in 1405. The subsequent annexation of the city, and the execution of the last members of the Carrara family, was a ruthless statement of intent. In the same year, the cities of Verona and Vicenza, fearing absorption by the even greater power of the Visconti, submitted to Venetian rule, seeking the Republic's protection. This rapid acquisition of a substantial mainland buffer state was not a matter of choice, but of survival. The struggle for the terra firma then became a protracted conflict with the Duchy of Milan. The long and costly Lombard wars that dominated the first half of the 15th century were fought to secure Venice's western frontier. The conquest of Brescia in 1426 and Bergamo in 1428 pushed Venetian dominion to the banks of the Adda River, establishing a vast land empire that secured its food supply and controlled the vital trade arteries to northern Europe. This dramatic pivot inland, however, came at a great cost, requiring the creation of a permanent land army, a reliance on expensive mercenary captains or condottieri, and enmeshing the once aloof Maritime Republic in the treacherous and interminable politics of the Italian peninsula. The acquisition of a land empire presented the Maritime Republic with a fundamental military paradox. It now needed a professional army, yet its own society, built on commerce and naval power, lacked the feudal structures and landed aristocracy that traditionally produced heavy cavalry and infantry commanders. The Venetian patriciate were merchants and diplomats, not knights. To wage its protracted wars on the Italian mainland, Venice turned to the prevailing military system of the age, the engagement of mercenary captains, or condottieri. These professional soldiers commanded private armies, complete with infantry, cavalry, and artillery, which they contracted out to the highest bidder through a formal legal document known as a condotta. This reliance on mercenaries was a pragmatic necessity, but it introduced a permanent element of instability and mistrust into Venetian military affairs. The Republic was now dependent on men whose loyalty was not to the state, but to profit and personal ambition. The relationship was inherently fraught, a high-stakes game of contract negotiation and political vigilance. The career of Francesco Busoni, known as Carmagnola, perfectly illustrates this perilous dynamic. Initially in the service of the Visconti of Milan, Carmagnola defected to Venice and was appointed Captain General of its forces in 1425. He led the Venetian army to significant victories, including the Battle of Meclodio in 1427, which secured the city of Brescia for the Republic. However, his subsequent lack of decisive action and his practice of releasing high-value prisoners aroused suspicion within the Venetian government. The Council of Ten, ever watchful for treason, began to suspect Carmagnola was deliberately prolonging the war, or worse, colluding with his former Milanese employers. In 1432, he was lured back to Venice under the pretense of a strategic conference, only to be arrested, tried in secret for treason, and publicly executed between the columns of the Piazzetta. His fate was a brutal warning to all future condottieri. Venetian patronage came with lethal scrutiny. A more enduring, though still complex, relationship was forged with Bartolomeo Colleoni, who served Venice for much of the mid-15th century. While he too had periods of conflict with the Republic, his long service against Milan's Sforza dynasty was largely successful. Upon his death, he bequeathed his vast fortune to the Republic on the condition that an equestrian statue be raised in his honor in the Piazza San Marco. The state accepted the fortune, but, unwilling to glorify an individual, even a loyal one, in its political heart, cleverly fulfilled the letter of the contract by erecting the magnificent statue in front of the Scuola Grande di San Marco instead. This system of employing and managing condottieri allowed Venice to fight and win the wars in Lombardy, but it consumed vast sums of state revenue and demanded constant, ruthless oversight to prevent the Republic's military servants from becoming its masters. The immense capital accumulated by the Republic and its patrician class during the 15th century found its most enduring expression in the High Renaissance, fostering a school of painting that stood apart from the intellectual traditions of Florence and Rome. Where Central Italian art was founded on the principle of disegno, emphasizing drawing, sculptural form, and intellectual structure, the Venetian school was defined by colorito, the supremacy of color, light, and expressive brushwork to convey emotion and atmosphere. This artistic divergence was funded by an unparalleled system of patronage, with the state, the wealthy scuole, and private merchants commissioning vast cycles of paintings to glorify God, the Republic, and themselves. The undisputed master of this era was Tiziano Vecellio, known as Titian. His career, spanning over 7 decades until his death in 1576, saw him become the most sought-after painter in Europe. Titian's genius lay in his revolutionary use of colour, applied not just to fill in outlines but to build form and create mood, and in the profound psychological depth of his portraiture. He served as the official painter to the Republic, but also attracted an international clientele, including the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and King Philip II of Spain, who valued his ability to convey power and humanity. His monumental altarpieces, such as the Assumption of the Virgin for the Frari Basilica, were exercises in dynamic composition and celestial light, while his later works displayed an astonishingly free and expressive brushstroke that verged on abstraction, profoundly influencing the future of painting. A generation younger and a constant rival to Titian's dominance was Jacopo Robusti, called Tintoretto. He was a painter of ferocious energy and ambition, whose personal motto was reputedly the drawing of Michelangelo and the colour of Titian. Tintoretto's work is characterized by its dramatic intensity, employing radical foreshortening, dramatic diagonals, and a powerful use of chiaroscuro, the contrast between light and dark. His immense speed, or prestezza, allowed him to undertake monumental commissions that would have been impossible for others. His masterwork is the vast narrative cycle painted for the Scuola Grande di San Rocco, a project that occupied him for over 20 years and contains more than 50 enormous canvases. For the state, he painted the colossal paradise on the end wall of the great council chamber in the Doge's palace, a swirling vortex of hundreds of figures that remains one of the largest oil paintings ever created. Together, Titian and Tintoretto, alongside contemporaries like Veronese, defined a uniquely Venetian Renaissance, one that celebrated worldly splendor and dramatic narrative through the sensuous and emotive power of color. While Venetian painters were exploring the emotive power of color, a different artistic revolution was taking place in stone and brick, driven by the singular vision of Andrea Palladio. Working primarily for the Venetian patriciate on their mainland estates, and for the Republic's most prestigious religious commissions, Palladio rejected the ornate Gothic and opulent decorative tendencies of his time to pursue a rigorous, intellectually grounded architecture based on the principles of classical antiquity. His work was not an imitation of the past, but a systematic reinterpretation of Roman architectural language for the needs of the 16th century. His education, sponsored by the humanist scholar Giangiorgio Trissino, was rooted in the direct study of ancient Roman ruins and, most importantly, the architectural treatise of Vitruvius. From these sources, Palladio developed a design philosophy based on mathematical harmony, symmetrical planning, and the logical application of the classical orders. His most influential creations were the numerous villas he designed for Venetian nobles on the terra firma. These were not merely suburban pleasure palaces, but the command centers of productive agricultural estates. Palladio integrated the living quarters, Casa Padronale, with the farm buildings, Barchesse, into a unified, symmetrical whole, often elevating the main residence on a podium and giving it the dignity of a Roman temple with a grand pedimented portico. The Villa Barbaro at Mesa and the Villa Emo at Fanzolo exemplify this fusion of function and classical grandeur. His most famous design, the Villa Capra, known as La Rotonda, near Vicenza, was a purely residential structure, a perfect cube with identical Ionic porticos on all four sides, surmounted by a central dome, a mathematically pure distillation of his ideals. Within Venice itself, Palladio adapted his principles to the unique urban fabric. His facades for the churches of San Giorgio Maggiore and Il Redentore are masterpieces of classical composition designed to be seen across the water. Using brilliant white Istrian stone, he layered temple fronts of different scales to create facades of immense complexity and harmony, solving the age-old problem of applying a classical facade to a Christian basilica with its high central nave and lower side aisles. His influence was codified and disseminated through his 1,570 treatises, I Quattro Libri dell'Architettura, the Four Books of Architecture. This meticulously illustrated work became the most influential architectural book ever published, spreading his ideas throughout Europe and to North America, where it formed the basis of the Palladian style that would dominate Western architecture for over 2 centuries. Concurrent with the city's artistic and architectural zenith, Venice became the undisputed center of a technological and intellectual transformation, the printing revolution. The Republic's unique combination of commercial dynamism, relative intellectual freedom from papal censorship, and its community of Greek émigré scholars made it the ideal environment for the new art of typography to flourish. Into this setting arrived the humanist scholar Aldus Manutius, who established the Aldine Press in 1494, with a mission that was more academic than commercial. His ambition was to rescue the entire corpus of Greek classical literature from the precarious existence of manuscript form and secure it in print. To achieve this, he gathered around him a circle of eminent scholars, creating what became known as the Neacademia, a Hellenist think tank dedicated to editing the most authoritative versions of classical texts. The press's output was prodigious, beginning with a complete 5-volume edition of Aristotle, a monumental undertaking that had never before been attempted. Aldus's most profound innovation, however, was not just what he printed, but how. He fundamentally changed the nature of the book itself, moving it from a large, static object chained in a library to a portable companion for personal study. He pioneered the octavo format, a small volume designed to be held comfortably in the hands, which he called libelli portatiles, or portable little books. To make these compact editions economically viable, he commissioned the punch cutter Francesco Griffo to develop a new typeface. The result was the first italic script, a dense, elegant font modelled on contemporary humanist handwriting that allowed more words to fit on a page, reducing the size and, crucially, the cost of each volume. These Aldine editions were not cheap reprints but masterpieces of scholarship and design. Each was meticulously edited from the best available manuscripts, setting a new standard for textual accuracy. The press's famous device, a dolphin wrapped around an anchor, and its accompanying motto, Festina lente, make haste slowly, perfectly encapsulated this philosophy of combining the rapid dissemination of print with painstaking scholarly care. By the time of his death in 1515, Aldus Manutius had published first editions of Thucydides, Herodotus, Sophocles, and Euripides, among many others, effectively creating the canon of Greek classics for the modern world and cementing Venice's position as the intellectual powerhouse of Renaissance Europe. The political and economic machinery of the Republic was operated by and for the benefit of a closed hereditary aristocracy whose existence was a study in contrasts, a life of immense private luxury, officially dedicated to austere public service. The Venetian patriciate, whose names were inscribed in the Golden Book, constituted a ruling class unlike any other in Europe. Their wealth, derived not from feudal landholdings but from international commerce and state investments, was displayed most conspicuously in their domestic architecture. The palaces lining the Grand Canal, with their intricate Gothic tracery, Byzantine marbles, and later, classical facades, were the public faces of private dynasties. These structures were both family homes and the headquarters of commercial enterprises, with the ground floor Portego serving as a warehouse and business office, while the upper floors, the piani nobili, housed lavish reception rooms and private apartments. Life within these palaces was governed by complex rituals of display. The interior spaces were furnished with oriental carpets, gilded furniture, and walls covered in leather or sumptuous velvets and damasks from the city's own looms. A family status was affirmed through its collection of art and antiquities, its private library, and the sheer opulence of its tableware, often made of silver or locally produced cristallo glass. This private splendor was matched by public pageantry. The calendar was filled with elaborate state-sponsored festivities, from the Doge's procession on major feast days to the annual Marriage of the Sea ceremony, each providing an opportunity for patrician families to display their wealth through their ceremonial barges, or bucentauri, and the richness of their attire. The Venetian Carnival, which evolved from a pre-Lenten celebration into a months-long season of masked balls and public entertainment, became the ultimate expression of this culture of controlled excess. Despite this ostentation, the state attempted to regulate extravagance through a series of sumptuary laws. These regulations prescribed the types of fabrics, the amount of jewelry, and even the number of dishes that could be served at a wedding feast, in an effort to curb competitive spending that could bankrupt families and disrupt social harmony. Yet, these laws were often ingeniously circumvented. A patrician might adhere to the prescribed dark, simple robes in public while wearing undergarments of the most expensive silk. This duality was central to the patrician ethos. The individual was expected to subordinate personal ambition to the collective good of the state, even as his family's immense wealth was the engine of that state's power. The Republic's century of mainland expansion had created an empire on the terra firma, but it had also sown the seeds of profound resentment among the powers whose ambitions it had checked. This simmering hostility coalesced in December 1508 into the League of Cambrai, an unprecedented diplomatic and military alliance with the explicit goal of dismantling Venice's continental state. The architect of the League was the formidable Pope Julius II, who sought to reclaim papal territories in the Romagna. He was joined by every major power with a claim on Venetian land. Louis XII of France coveted the rich Lombard cities of Brescia, Bergamo, and Cremona. Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I desired Padua, Verona, and the Veneto, and Ferdinand II of Aragon aimed to recover the Apulian port cities pledged to Venice as security for a loan. The combined weight of this coalition represented an existential threat of a magnitude the Republic had never before faced. The war began in April 1509, and the decisive blow fell with shocking speed. On May 14, at the Battle of Agnadello, the French army under Louis XII inflicted a catastrophic defeat upon the Venetian forces. A fatal disagreement between the two Venetian condottieri, the cautious Niccolò di Pitigliano and the impetuous Bartolomeo d'Alviano, led to Alviano engaging the French without support, resulting in the annihilation of the most effective wing of the Venetian army. The military consequences were immediate and total. The Venetian state on the mainland evaporated in a matter of weeks. Lacking a field army to defend them, cities that had been under Venetian rule for generations, including Vicenza, Verona, and Padua, opened their gates to the imperial forces of Maximilian. The French occupied Lombardy, and the Pope seized the cities of Ravenna, Faenza, and Rimini. For the first time in its history, the Republic was pushed back to the water's edge, its survival hanging by the thinnest of threads. In this moment of supreme crisis, the Venetian state demonstrated its most profound strength, not military might, but diplomatic resilience. The Senate made a calculated and humiliating decision to formally release its mainland subjects from their oaths of fealty, a move designed to spare them from brutal sieges and to foster a residual loyalty that might be exploited later. Having abandoned its empire on land, Venice turned its full attention to the painstaking work of dismantling the alliance that sought to destroy it, beginning with the principal instigator, Pope Julius II, whose fear of French and imperial domination in Italy might, the Venetians wagered, prove even greater than his hatred for the Republic. The intricate system of councils and committees that defined the Venetian Republic had one ultimate objective: the prevention of tyranny by ensuring that no single individual could ever accumulate absolute power. The office of the Doge, once a position of considerable executive authority, became the ultimate expression of this principle through its systematic transformation into a purely ceremonial role. By the High Renaissance, the Doge was no longer a ruler, but the chief prisoner of the state, his life a meticulously choreographed performance of republican majesty. This transition was codified through the Promission Ducale, a complex coronation oath that each new Doge was required to swear upon his election. With each successive reign, this document became more restrictive, adding new clauses that limited the Doge's ability to conduct foreign policy, control state finances, or even correspond privately with other rulers without the oversight of a council. His personal business dealings were suspended, his family members were barred from holding key offices, and his every public utterance was scripted by the governing bodies. He was the living embodiment of the state, but he possessed no independent political will. The Doge's existence was instead governed by an unceasing calendar of ritual. These public ceremonies were not mere pageantry, they were the very substance of his function, designed to personify the continuity and divine favour of La Serenissima. The most significant of these was the annual Marriage of the Sea, held on Ascension Day. Aboard the magnificent state barge, the Bucintoro, the Doge would sail to the entrance of the Lido, where he would cast a consecrated gold ring into the waters, declaring, "We wed thee, O sea," as a sign of true and perpetual dominion. This act was a potent piece of political theatre, reaffirming Venice's maritime destiny and its mastery over the Adriatic. His daily life was similarly circumscribed by public duty. He presided over sessions of the Great Council and the Senate from an elevated throne, but he could not introduce legislation or vote on matters of state. He received foreign ambassadors in the splendor of the Doge's palace, but the content of his speeches was dictated by the Senate. Every aspect of his life, from the robes he wore to the route of his processions, was regulated by law to reinforce the idea that he was a servant of the Republic, not its master. This transformation of the ducal office from a center of power to a symbol of it was the aristocracy's ultimate triumph, a constitutional masterpiece that ensured collective rule and preserved the Republic from the monarchical ambitions that had consumed every other Italian state. The survival of the Republic, a small state navigating the perilous currents of European power politics, depended less on the size of its armies than on the quality of its information. To this end, Venice perfected a state intelligence apparatus that was unparalleled in its scope, sophistication, and systematic professionalism. The foundation of this network was the diplomatic corps, whose ambassadors were understood to be the state's chief intelligence officers. Upon completing their tenure, typically 2 to 3 years, every ambassador was legally required to submit a final, comprehensive report, a relazione, to the Senate. These documents were masterpieces of political and social analysis, meticulously detailing the military strength, economic health, political factions, and even the personal habits and psychological disposition of the ruler in the court to which they had been assigned. The relazioni were not mere collections of facts, but analytical tools, archived and studied by the ruling class to inform long-term foreign policy. This institutionalized practice of information gathering and analysis provided Venetian policymakers with a strategic advantage that no other state could match. Beneath this overt diplomatic layer existed a vast and clandestine world of espionage, managed with ruthless efficiency by the Council of Ten. This secret network was populated by a diverse cast of agents and informants, known as confidenti. They were recruited from every level of society, from disaffected nobles in foreign courts to merchants whose trade provided perfect cover for observation, to priests who could gather intelligence in the confessional, and artisans whose skills gave them access to sensitive locations. The Republic's agents employed advanced cryptographic methods, including the development of sophisticated ciphers that were notoriously difficult for foreign powers to break. Information flowed back to the lagoon through a network of couriers, who used prearranged routes and secret dead drops to transmit their findings. The Council of Ten processed this raw intelligence, cross-referencing reports from multiple sources to verify their accuracy before presenting condensed summaries to the Senate. This created a centralized system where political, economic, and military information was constantly updated and integrated into the state's decision-making process. The Venetian state treated knowledge as its most precious commodity and its most effective weapon, creating a culture of espionage that was not an ad hoc response to crises, but a permanent and essential pillar of its government. The final siege of Constantinople in the spring of 1453, orchestrated by the 21-year-old Sultan Mehmed II, represented a turning point in world history that resonated with particular violence in the halls of the Doge's palace. For Venice, the event was not a distant tragedy, but an immediate and catastrophic geopolitical realignment. The Republic's official participation in the city's defense was minimal, a testament to its pragmatic hesitation to fully commit to a losing cause. Yet the Venetian bailo, Girolamo Minotto, and the small contingent of Venetian merchants and sailors present fought with distinction. The city's fall on May 29th, after a 53-day siege enabled by massive Ottoman cannons cast by the engineer Orban, instantly erased a cornerstone of Venetian foreign and commercial policy that had stood for centuries. The immediate consequences were brutal. The Venetian quarter was sacked, its warehouses looted, and Minotto, along with other prominent Venetians, was publicly executed. The loss of life and property was a severe blow, but the strategic damage was incalculable. Constantinople had been the linchpin of the Republic's eastern trade, the primary entrepot through which the riches of the Black Sea and the Silk Road flowed into Venetian galleys. With the Bosphorus now under the absolute control of a single hostile power, these vital trade routes were severed. The Black Sea, for centuries a playground for competing Italian maritime states, became an Ottoman lake overnight. The fall of the city signaled the final extinction of the Byzantine Empire, an entity with which Venice had shared a long and deeply complex relationship of alliance, rivalry, and codependence. In its place rose a new and far more dangerous entity, a centralized, militantly expansionist Ottoman Empire with ambitions that now directly threatened Venice's own maritime empire, the Stato da Mar. The scattered Venetian colonies in the Aegean and Ionian seas, once valuable commercial outposts, were transformed into vulnerable frontline fortresses. The Republic was forced into a fundamental strategic pivot, from a primarily commercial power that waged war to protect its trade, to a state engaged in a permanent, grinding, and ruinously expensive military struggle for its very survival against a formidable imperial foe. The age of commercial competition with Genoa was over. The age of existential conflict with the Ottoman Sultan had begun. The existential conflict, inaugurated by the fall of Constantinople, quickly devolved into a protracted and ruinous struggle for Venice's overseas possessions. The Ottoman war machine, now directed by Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, turned its attention to the systematic dismantling of the Stato da Mar. The First Ottoman-Venetian War, which erupted in 1463, was not a conflict of commercial rivalry, but a grinding war of imperial conquest. The initial Ottoman thrusts targeted the Republic's holdings in the Morea, capturing Argos and wearing down Venetian garrisons through constant raids. The financial strain on the Venetian treasury was immediate and immense, as the Senate was forced to levy new taxes and raise forced loans from its patriciate to fund the construction of new war fleets and the reinforcement of its scattered island fortresses. The centerpiece of Venice's Aegean Empire, and the primary target of Mehmed's ambition, was the great island of Euboea, known to the Venetians as Negroponte. This was not a mere trading post, but a full-fledged Venetian colony, a vital naval base, and a source of significant agricultural wealth. Its loss in 1470, after a brutal siege, represented a profound strategic and psychological blow. An enormous Ottoman army and fleet, personally led by the Sultan, overwhelmed the Venetian defenders under Paolo Erizzo. The subsequent sack of the capital city was notoriously brutal, sending shockwaves of terror throughout Christendom and demonstrating that no Venetian possession, however well fortified, was safe from Ottoman power. Throughout the 16-year conflict, the Ottoman navy, once a negligible force, grew in strength and sophistication, challenging Venetian fleets in open battle and perfecting the amphibious assault tactics necessary to conquer island strongholds. One by one, Venetian possessions fell, the islands of Lemnos and Imbros, along with trading posts along the Albanian coast. By the time the Republic sued for peace in 1479, its position in the Aegean was shattered. The resulting Treaty of Constantinople was a humiliating recognition of this new reality. Venice was forced to cede Negroponte, pay a substantial war indemnity, and agree to an annual tribute for the right to trade in what was now an Ottoman-dominated Black Sea. The age of Venetian expansion in the east was definitively over. The long, costly, and bloody retreat had begun. The island of Cyprus, acquired by the Republic in 1489, was not a mere colony, but the crown jewel of the Stato da Mar, a possession of immense strategic and economic value. Its fields produced lucrative cash crops, primarily sugar and cotton, while its salt pans generated substantial revenue for the state monopoly. Its location provided a crucial outpost for monitoring Ottoman naval movements and protecting the Levantine trade routes. This wealth and position made it an inevitable target for the expansionist ambitions of Sultan Selim II, who in 1570 dispatched an overwhelming invasion force under the command of Lala Mustafa Pasha. The initial assault quickly subdued the island's interior. The capital, Nicosia, with its state-of-the-art but undermanned fortifications, fell after a 7-week siege, its capture followed by a brutal massacre that horrified Europe and served as a stark warning to the last remaining Venetian stronghold, the port city of Famagusta. Here, the Venetian commander, Marcantonio Bragadin, commanded a small garrison of a few thousand professional soldiers and local militia. For 11 months, from August 1570 to August 1571, this small force withstood a relentless siege by an Ottoman army that swelled to over 100 men. The defenders repelled multiple massive assaults, enduring constant artillery bombardment and engaging in ferocious hand-to-hand combat amidst the rubble of their own walls. With their gunpowder exhausted, their ranks decimated by combat and disease, and all hope of a relief fleet from the west extinguished, Bragadin finally negotiated terms of surrender. Lala Mustafa Pasha offered generous conditions, promising the surviving defenders and civilians safe passage to Venetian Crete. On August 1571, the Venetians marched out to hand over the city. What followed was an act of calculated treachery. The Ottoman commander, feigning a dispute, violated the truce and had the Venetian officers seized. The remnants of the garrison were either slaughtered or enslaved. The fate reserved for Bragadin himself was one of unparalleled cruelty, designed as a spectacle of terror. After suffering a series of mutilations, he was flayed alive in the city's main square. His skin was stuffed with straw, dressed in his commander's insignia, and paraded through the streets before being hoisted to the masthead of the Ottoman flagship. The traumatic loss of Cyprus and the news of Bragadin's martyrdom galvanized the creation of a Holy League. But it came too late to save the island, which was now permanently lost to the Ottoman Empire. The martyrdom of Bragadin and the fall of Cyprus served as the brutal catalyst for a military response that Venice alone could no longer muster. Under the tireless diplomatic efforts of Pope Pius V, the disparate and often antagonistic interests of Catholic Europe were forged into a Holy League, uniting the naval power of Venice, the vast resources of Philip II's Spain, the Papal States, and other Italian principalities. The resulting Christian fleet that assembled at Messina in the summer of 1571 was the largest such force seen in centuries, a colossal armada under the supreme command of the young and charismatic Don John of Austria. The Venetian contribution was central to this enterprise, comprising nearly half of the fleet's 208 galleys, and, crucially, providing the 6 heavily armed galleasses that would prove tactically decisive. These floating fortresses, crewed by Venetian specialists, represented a significant technological advantage, mounting heavy artillery on their broadsides in a manner that traditional war galleys could not match. On October 7, 1571, this allied force met the Ottoman fleet under Muezzin Zad Ali Pasha near Lepanto, at the mouth of the Gulf of Patras. The ensuing battle was a brutal, close-quarters melee of a scale almost without precedent in naval history. The Christian line, led by the lumbering galleasses, disrupted the Ottoman formation with devastating initial broadsides, sowing chaos before the main lines of galleys clashed. The fighting devolved into thousands of individual ship-to-ship actions, with soldiers swarming over enemy decks in a bloody struggle that lasted for over 4 hours. The tactical outcome was a resounding, almost total victory for the Holy League. The Ottoman fleet was annihilated, Ali Pasha was killed, his flagship captured, and the Ottoman standard taken. An estimated 200 Ottoman galleys were sunk or captured, and thousands of Christian galley slaves were liberated. The battle shattered the long-held myth of Ottoman naval invincibility and was celebrated across Europe as a miraculous, divinely ordained triumph. For Venice, however, the victory proved to be strategically hollow. The deep-seated political divisions within the Holy League, particularly conflicting priorities of Spain and the Republic, prevented any effective follow-up. The Allies failed to launch a coordinated campaign to recapture Cyprus or any other significant territory. Drained financially and unable to sustain the alliance, Venice was forced to negotiate a separate and deeply humiliating peace with the Ottoman Empire in 1573. In the final treaty, the Republic formally ceded Cyprus, recognized its other losses, and paid a massive war indemnity to the Sultan. Lepanto was a glorious tactical victory, but it failed to alter the strategic reality. The tide of Ottoman power in the eastern Mediterranean continued its inexorable advance. While Venice was consumed by its existential struggle with the Ottoman Empire, a more profound and ultimately more fatal challenge to its prosperity was materializing on the far side of the continent. For centuries, the Republic's immense wealth had been built upon a geographical certainty: its position as the European terminus of the global spice trade. The precious cargoes of pepper, cloves, and cinnamon that flowed from Asia through the Levant were funneled almost exclusively through Venetian counting houses before being distributed at immense profit across Europe. This monopoly was the bedrock of the Venetian economy. The seismic shift began in 1499, when the ships of the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama returned to Lisbon, having successfully navigated a direct all-sea route to India around the southern tip of Africa. This single voyage rendered Venice's geographical advantage obsolete overnight. The news was met in the Rialto with stunned disbelief, a sentiment captured by the diarist Girolamo Priuli, who noted that the entire city was stupefied. The economic impact was immediate and catastrophic. Spices arriving in Lisbon, free from the layers of tariffs and taxes imposed by Mamluk sultans and Venetian merchants, were sold at a fraction of their traditional price, collapsing the value of the Republic's most lucrative trade. The Venetian state, recognizing the existential nature of the threat, reacted not with resignation but with desperate strategic maneuvering. Emissaries were dispatched to the Mamluk Sultanate in Cairo, proposing a joint venture to disrupt Portuguese shipping in the Indian Ocean, and even exploring the radical, centuries ahead of its time idea of excavating a canal at Suez to create a competing route. Simultaneously, the discovery of the Americas by the Spanish created a second, equally powerful economic pole in the Atlantic. The vast quantities of silver flowing from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas shifted the financial center of gravity from the Mediterranean to the port of Seville and the markets of Antwerp. The global economy was being rewired, and Venice, once at its center, now found itself on a strategic periphery. This was not a sudden collapse, but the beginning of a long, inexorable commercial decline. The lucrative spice caravans dwindled, and the great Venetian galley fleets found their primary reason for being fundamentally undermined. The Republic's economic foundations were not destroyed, but they were irrevocably altered, forcing a slow and painful reorientation away from the global trade that had been the very source of its power. The Italian plague of 1629–1631, a virulent resurgence of bubonic plague that swept across the peninsula, arrived at the gates of Venice not as a sudden cataclysm, but as an insidious infiltration that overwhelmed the Republic's formidable public health defences. The city's Magistrato alla Sanità, a permanent state body with extensive powers, had meticulously developed quarantine protocols over centuries, yet the contagion found its vector in the autumn of 1630 through an ambassador from the plague-stricken city of Mantua. Despite the envoy and his retinue being confined to the quarantine island of San Servolo, a local carpenter who worked on their lodgings became the city's first victim, and the pestilence began its inexorable spread through the densely packed urban core. The epidemic that followed was catastrophic, paralyzing the city with a speed and lethality that dwarfed previous outbreaks. Public life disintegrated as shops closed, trade ceased, and the arsenal's workshops fell silent. The state-run quarantine hospitals, the Lazzaretto Vecchio and Nuovo, were quickly overwhelmed, forcing authorities to convert dozens of other buildings, and even anchored ships, into makeshift isolation wards. By the spring of 1631, the mortality rate had reached apocalyptic levels, with hundreds dying each day. The traditional system for collecting and burying the dead collapsed entirely, leaving bodies to accumulate in homes and public squares. The final death toll was staggering. An estimated 46 inhabitants of the city proper perished, representing nearly a third of the population. Across the wider territories of the lagoon, the number approached 100. Faced with a disaster that defied all human remedy, the Venetian Senate, led by Doge Niccolò Contarini, turned to divine intercession. On October 22, 1630, in a solemn public vow, the government pledged to construct a magnificent new church in honor of the Virgin Mary if she would deliver the city from the plague. The Senate decreed that the state would fund the project and that the Doge and his successors would lead an annual procession to the new temple to commemorate the city's deliverance. As the pestilence finally began to wane in late 1631, the Republic prepared to fulfill its sacred promise. An architectural competition was held, and the commission was awarded to a young and relatively unknown architect, Baldassare Longhena. His visionary design for a massive octagonal domed basilica to be built at the entrance of the Grand Canal was chosen for its theatrical grandeur. The resulting church of Santa Maria della Salute, Our Lady of Health, became a permanent and powerful monument in the Venetian landscape, a votive offering born from unimaginable suffering, and a testament to the city's collective trauma and enduring faith. The mid-17th century subjected the Venetian Republic to its most protracted and agonizing military commitment, the War of Candia, a conflict that would last for a quarter of a century. The casus belli, an attack on an Ottoman convoy by the Knights of Malta, who then sought shelter in a Cretan port in 1644, provided Sultan Ibrahim I with the pretext to launch a massive invasion of Venice's most prized and prosperous colony. In 1645, a formidable Ottoman expeditionary force landed on Crete and, within months, swiftly overran the island's provincial defences, leaving only the heavily fortified capital city of Candia and a few isolated island fortresses in Venetian hands. What followed was one of the longest and most grueling sieges in modern history. The war evolved into a brutal contest of attrition, with Venetian strategy fundamentally bifurcated. On Crete, the conflict was a desperate defensive struggle centered on the elaborate fortifications of Candia, a masterpiece of Renaissance military engineering. For 22 years, the city's garrison, a multinational force of Venetian regulars, local militia, and European volunteers, withstood a relentless cycle of bombardment, assault, and sapping. The fighting was characterized by incessant underground warfare, a grim struggle of mine and countermine in the subterranean passages beneath the city's bastions. At sea, the Venetian navy executed a daring but ultimately unsustainable strategy to blockade the Dardanelles, attempting to choke off the stream of Ottoman reinforcements and supplies flowing to Crete. Under commanders like Lazzaro Mocenigo, the Venetian fleet won several notable victories, but the immense financial and human cost of maintaining a permanent naval presence so far from home slowly bled the Republic's resources dry. The final decisive phase of the siege began in 1666, with the arrival of the Ottoman Grand Vizier, Ahmed Köprülü, who brought a new level of intensity and engineering expertise to the Ottoman operations. The last 3 years were a relentless nightmare of attrition, with thousands of tons of earth moved for trenches and tens of thousands of lives lost in near-daily assaults. Despite the heroic efforts of the defenders and a final, ill-fated expedition of French volunteers, the fortress was rendered untenable. In September 1669, the Venetian commander, Francesco Morosini, recognizing the impossibility of further resistance, negotiated an honorable surrender that allowed the surviving garrison and citizens to evacuate. The fall of Candia was a traumatic and irreversible blow. The war had cost the Republic an estimated 134 million ducats and over 30 lives, crippling its finances and confirming the loss of its last major possession in the Levant. The dawn of the 18th century found the Venetian Republic in a state of profound strategic exhaustion, its demographic and financial resources depleted by centuries of continuous warfare. The colossal struggles against the Ottoman Empire, culminating in the loss of Crete, had been followed by a brief, costly, and ultimately futile reconquest of the Morea in the 1680s, which was lost again by 1718. These final military exertions confirmed a stark new reality. The Republic no longer possessed the material or human capacity to compete with the great territorial empires that now dominated the European continent. In response to this diminished status, the Venetian ruling class consciously and deliberately adopted a formal policy of permanent, unarmed neutrality. This was not a passive retreat from international affairs, but an active and intricate diplomatic strategy designed for survival in an age of giants. The decision represented a fundamental redefinition of the state's purpose, shifting its primary objective from maritime expansion and commercial hegemony to the preservation of its political independence and the remnants of its wealth. This doctrine required Venice to meticulously extricate itself from the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined European politics. Throughout the great dynastic wars of the 18th century, the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Polish Succession, and the 7 Years' War, the Republic steadfastly refused to commit its forces to either the Bourbon or Habsburg blocs. Venetian ambassadors became masters of diplomatic equivocation, skillfully navigating the pressures from Vienna, Paris, and Madrid, while a much reduced military adopted a purely defensive posture. The once mighty Venetian navy was repurposed for anti-piracy patrols and the protection of its dwindling commercial shipping, while the army's sole function became the garrisoning of the terra firma fortresses. This policy successfully preserved Venice from the devastation of the major continental wars, allowing its patriciate to cultivate an unprecedented era of cultural splendor and aristocratic leisure. While the rest of Europe engaged in bloody conflict, Venice became the continent's playground, a center for tourism, art, and carnival. However, this century of peace was purchased at the cost of military atrophy. The arsenal, once the industrial heart of a global power, produced fewer and fewer modern warships, and the army's training and equipment fell dangerously behind the standards of the great powers. The long peace created a political culture that valued stability above all else, rendering the Republic incapable of conceiving, let alone responding to, the revolutionary ideological and military forces that would emerge from France at the century's end. The policy of neutrality, so successful in the static world of 18th century dynastic politics, would prove to be a fatal liability in the face of a new, expansionist ideology that did not respect traditional borders or time-honored diplomacy. The Republic's strategic pivot to neutrality fostered a new kind of international prominence, transforming the city from a maritime powerhouse into the indispensable final destination of the Grand Tour. For the young, wealthy aristocrats of Northern Europe, this extended journey through the cultural centers of the continent was the capstone of their classical education, and Venice offered a unique curriculum of pleasure and social license. The city's economy reoriented itself to cater to this influx of elite tourism, cultivating an infrastructure of sophisticated indulgence. Central to this transformation was the institution of the carnival, which by the 18th century had expanded from a brief pre-Lenten festival into a state-sanctioned season of revelry that could last for months. The critical instrument of this social inversion was the mask, particularly the standardized white volto or lava worn with a black cape and tricorn hat, known as the borta. This uniform of anonymity systematically dissolved the rigid social hierarchies of the era, allowing nobles and commoners, locals and foreigners to interact on a plane of temporary equality in a way that was unthinkable anywhere else in Europe. This state-sponsored anonymity facilitated the flourishing of institutions built entirely on vice. In 1638, the state opened the Ridotto in the Palazzo Dandolo, the first public government-sanctioned casino in the Western world. While technically open to all, its high-stakes games and formal atmosphere ensured that its clientele was almost exclusively the masked patriciate and wealthy foreign visitors. The city's famous courtesans also became a structured part of the tourist experience, operating within a well-defined social spectrum. At the apex were the courtigianes honestes, the honest courtesans, educated women known for their wit, musical talents, and literary skills, who functioned as intellectual companions, as much as objects of desire. They were distinct from the thousands of lower-class prostitutes, yet both were tacitly accepted by the state as a necessary component of the city's appeal. This ecosystem of controlled licentiousness, the anonymity of the masque, the state-run gambling house, and the socially stratified world of the courtesan defined Venice's final century. It was a calculated performance of decadence, a magnificent but fragile masquerade that concealed the terminal decline of the Republic's political and military power behind a dazzling facade of pleasure. The political stagnation and military decline of the 18th century Republic were paradoxically accompanied by a final, incandescent burst of cultural and artistic brilliance. This cultural efflorescence was defined by the genius of three figures who perfected the Venetian expression of the late Baroque and Rococo. In music, the dominant figure was Antonio Vivaldi, the Red Priest, whose work as the Maestro di Concerto at the Ospedale della Pietà, an orphanage for girls, elevated its all-female orchestra to international stardom. The concerts at the Pietà became a primary attraction, with Vivaldi composing hundreds of concertos that showcased the virtuosity of his pupils. His compositions, characterized by their rhythmic vitality, formal clarity, and novel instrumental combinations, fundamentally shaped the development of the concerto form. His most famous work, The Four Seasons, was a revolutionary example of program music, its vivid musical depictions of natural scenes captivating audiences across Europe and establishing a new standard for descriptive composition. In the visual arts, the era belonged to Giovanni Battista Tiepolo, the last of the great Venetian history painters. His mastery of large-scale fresco painting created vast, light-filled illusionistic ceilings that seemed to open onto celestial realms. Working with a palette of luminous, airy colours, Tiepolo decorated the palaces and churches of the Venetian patriciate, but his fame was international. His most significant commission, the monumental frescoes for the Prince-Bishop's residence in Würzburg, Germany, represented the apotheosis of the Rococo style, a testament to how Venetian artistic influence persisted long after its political power had waned. In the theatre, Carlo Goldoni initiated a profound reform of Italian comedy. He challenged the centuries-old conventions of the improvisational commedia dell'arte, with its stock characters and masks, advocating for a more realistic, scripted theatre based on the observation of contemporary society. His plays, such as The Servant of Two Masters and The Mistress of the Inn, abandoned caricature in favour of psychologically nuanced characters drawn from the Venetian bourgeoisie and aristocracy. Goldoni's work provided a sharp, often satirical, mirror to the society of his day, documenting its customs, class tensions, and moral hypocrisies. Together, the music of Vivaldi, the frescoes of Tiepolo, and the comedies of Goldoni formed the magnificent cultural testament of a republic in its twilight, a final, dazzling display of creative energy before the political structure that had nurtured it collapsed into history. The meticulously preserved world of the 18th century Venetian Republic, insulated by its policy of neutrality, was utterly unprepared for the ideological and military tempest unleashed by the French Revolution. The challenge arrived in the person of General Napoleon Bonaparte, appointed commander of the French army of Italy in 1796. He represented a new and terrifying form of power, one not bound by the dynastic protocols and limited warfare that had governed European politics for a century. Bonaparte's campaign was a whirlwind of motion and decisive battle that shattered the static political map of northern Italy. His victories over the Austrian and Piedmontese forces at Montenotte, Lodi, and Arcole were not merely tactical triumphs. They were revolutionary acts that dismantled ancient states and replaced them with French-controlled sister republics, such as the Cispadane and later the Cisalpine Republic. Venice's long-standing neutrality, the cornerstone of its foreign policy, was rendered meaningless. Bonaparte's new order had no place for a 1,000-year-old aristocratic republic that refused to take a side. He viewed Venice with a mixture of contempt for its political decadence and cold calculation of its strategic value. The Republic's mainland territory, the terra firma, became the primary theatre of operations for the French and Austrian armies, and Bonaparte made no pretense of respecting its sovereignty, marching his troops across it at will and demanding supplies from its cities. He began to systematically apply pressure, fomenting democratic rebellions in Venetian subject cities like Bergamo and Brescia, and openly accusing the Venetian government of arming its populace against the French. This was a war of nerves and propaganda for which the Venetian oligarchy had no answer. Their diplomatic traditions were based on patience, precedent, and the assumption of a shared aristocratic worldview. Bonaparte's methods were direct, threatening, and backed by the most effective military force in Europe. The ancient, slow-moving machinery of the Venetian state, perfected over centuries to ensure stability and prevent radical change, was now confronted by a force that embodied rapid, violent transformation. The Republic's military was a shadow of its former self, its political will paralyzed by indecision. The arrival of Bonaparte was not just a military threat, it was an existential one, a direct confrontation with a modern world for which Venice had no political or psychological preparation. The final weeks of the Republic's existence unfolded not with the drama of a heroic defense, but with the quiet panic of a political system confronting its own obsolescence. The pretext Napoleon Bonaparte required to extinguish Venetian sovereignty was delivered by a series of events in April 1797. The anti-French uprising in Verona, known as the Pasque Veronese, was brutally suppressed by his forces, providing him with a grievance. Simultaneously, the Venetian fort at the Lido fired upon a French vessel, the Le Libérateur d'Italie, which was attempting to enter the lagoon, killing its captain. Bonaparte seized upon these incidents, declaring them acts of war and delivering an ultimatum that amounted to a demand for the complete capitulation of the state. Inside the Doge's palace, the Venetian oligarchy was gripped by a collective paralysis. The last Doge, Ludovico Manin, a man of indecisive character, presided over a government incapable of formulating a response. The intricate system of councils, designed over centuries to diffuse power and prevent rash action, now guaranteed only inaction. Faced with Bonaparte's explicit threat to sack the city, the ruling patricians abandoned any pretense of resistance. On May 12, 1797, the Great Council was convened for its final, fateful session. The atmosphere in the Grand Chamber was not one of defiant debate, but of hurried capitulation. With French troops massed on the lagoon's edge and the sound of musket shots from the city below, mistaken for the beginning of an insurrection, the patricians voted in a state of terror. The motion to abolish the ancient constitution and accept a provisional democratic government dictated by the French passed with an overwhelming majority of 512 to 30, with 5 abstentions. It was a formal act of state suicide. The 1,000-year-old republic was not conquered. Its own ruling class voted it out of existence to save their palaces from plunder. A few days later, as he removed his ducal horn, the corno ducale, Ludovico Manin reportedly handed it to his servant, stating, "Take it, I shall not be needing it again." On May 15, French soldiers were ferried into the city, occupying it without a single shot being fired in its defense. The long history of La Serenissima ended not with a climactic naval battle, but with the quiet, bureaucratic transfer of power. With the Republic's political extinction, Venice ceased to be a state and began its transformation into a powerful, enduring myth. The real city, now a pawn of European geopolitics, was formally handed over to the Austrian Empire by Napoleon at the Treaty of Campo Formio in October 1797. This act confirmed its new status, no longer a historical agent, but a historical artifact. It was this political death that allowed for its cultural rebirth in the imagination of the 19th century. The Romantic movement found in the city's silent canals and decaying palazzi the perfect embodiment of its ideals. It was the English art critic John Ruskin, through his monumental work The Stones of Venice, who most effectively codified the myth. He constructed a powerful narrative that contrasted the moral and spiritual purity of the city's medieval Gothic architecture with what he saw as the corrupt, decadent classicism of its Renaissance. For Ruskin, Venice's decline was a moral failure, and its beauty was inseparable from its decay, a concept that would dominate artistic and literary interpretations for the next century. This duality became the core of the Venetian myth. Lord Byron, living in crumbling grandeur, wrote of its faded glory, while painters like J.M.W. Turner dissolved its architecture into ethereal studies of light and water, capturing not a real city, but a dreamlike memory of one. The city became a symbolic landscape for exploring profound themes of mortality and desire. For Henry James, it was a place of exquisite melancholy and complex social observation. For Thomas Mann in Death in Venice, the city became the ultimate symbol of the indivisible link between sublime beauty and disease, a place where aesthetic perfection masked a fatal pestilence. This potent myth was sustained by the city's arrested development. Economic stagnation under Austrian and later Italian rule preserved its physical fabric, turning it into a living museum. Venice became less a place to live and more a destination to be experienced, the ultimate object of cultural pilgrimage, where visitors could contemplate the mortality of power and the persistence of beauty. Its legacy was thus secured not by the actions of its now vanished councils, but by the artists and writers who transformed its historical reality into a universal symbol within the collective imagination of the world.